Hey, how's it going, guys? This is your boy Hazzed, and today on the Shadowlands PTR Prepatch, we're going to be doing a Frost DK Mythic Plus build spec, kind of, what we're going to be doing after level 50, because as we know, our neck's going to disappear, our corruptions are going to disappear, and obviously the powers on our azerite abilities are going to disappear, which is really going to change up how we're doing things and what's going to be overall stronger than each other. And in this video, we're going to go into detail as of why. So let's go ahead and do this. So starting out, the first thing we're going to do obviously is take off our neck, which we're going to lose Blood of the Enemy, Memory of Lucid Dream, Essence of Focusing Iris, and Breath of the Dying. So basically procs, haste, some runes, a little bit of versatility, and of course burst pressure / crit. So we're going to go ahead and pop that off. Now what that's going to do to our abilities is things like obviously our azerite traits. Frost's Indignation is absolutely strong in Mythic Plus scenarios when it comes to playing a Frost DK, when you're pairing it with Frost Scythe and Ice Cap, causing your damage reduction on your major abilities, your major cooldowns to go absolutely just through the floor. Like, you just don't have any downtime at all as long as you have a lot of crit, like over 30%, and you're just never going to have downtime on that pillar. I think my DK on live is closer to 50%, so when he starts actually DPSing stuff, he almost is hitting like 100% crit, which is just absolutely gnarly in terms of Mythic Plus DPS. But that being said, without actually having the Frost Indignation on our shoulders, Ice Cap tends to fall behind when it comes to two-handed DPS, and we're going to go ahead and switch over from using Ice Cap to Obliteration, since we're not going to be able to rely on that large amount of burst pressure and the damage reduction of Ice Cap to do our AoE pressure. Also, the loss of consistent pressure we're losing on our neck by losing, let's say, Memory of Lucid Dreams is also going to put us a little bit more towards the controlled part of Frost instead of that wild, let me just reduce this crazy proc damage insanely amount and go ahead and throw that in. Now, the other reason we're switching to Obliteration over Ice Cap is obviously without those key abilities and let's say an ample amount of crit that's slowly going to be reduced as you're leveling up towards, let's say, level cap in Shadowlands. Ice Cap is going to get weaker and weaker within each level, while Obliteration, obviously the crit damage on Obliteration is going to increase over time, heavily favoring Obliteration comparison to Ice Cap, obviously using a two-hander. Now, the other change I'm currently making, and I've been doing a ton of testing with Gathering Storms versus Glacial Advance. Now, obviously, I've got, not on that one, this one, Frozen Tempest on this and Frozen Tempest on this, which obviously with Gathering Storms is going to make my Gathering Storms a lot stronger with the Ice Cap build overall, until obviously we take the neck off, in which case I'm going to flop over to using Glacial Advance, and that's going to be for multiple reasons. For one, using Obliteration, it does proc an Obliteration guaranteed crit with Frost Scythe, which gives you a lot more damage and burst pressure during your burst when it comes to cleave. And that's going to kind of fill in every 3 to 4 seconds. You're going to throw that up to hopefully grant yourself a nice good old Frost Scythe. After that, outside of burst, you just kind of throw it whenever it's off cooldown to deal quite a bit of AoE pressure, while also keeping up Razor Ice stacks on the target, because we do have an ability that gives us Razor Ice now as 200, which is really nice to see overall. So really, that's all the kind of changes that are going to be happening with the two-handed spec as soon as you hit like level 51, and your necklace and your azerite shoulders and things like that just obviously stop working, which I assume is going to be what happens. So we need to touch on stats. Now, what stats are we going to be running for this two-handed Mythic Plus build? Well, obviously we're running Frost Scythe, so we're going to need around 20 to 25% crit. That's just kind of like overall what you need to benefit from a 1 in 4 chance to make Frost Scythe crit, which gives it a bit more damage than obviously just spamming Obliterates. So that's going to put us a little bit ahead there. Now, the other reason we're playing a Mastery build over, let's say, Haste is Obliteration. Obliteration is going to give you a bit more of a controlled burst instead of just kind of randomly spamming Frost Scythe over time to reduce the cooldown reduction so you can proc up more dragons with your Ice Cap. Keep up, let's say, your Pillar and then your Pillar Afterburst and the extra Mastery damage you're going to get from using your dragons. Now, that's all obviously going to fall off. So kind of like the controlled Obliteration burst is going to go ahead and give us quite a bit more pressure, since the majority of damage when it comes to cleave is really all frost damage. Now, our single target damage is going to be a bit heavy towards the melee side until we start leveling up into Shadowlands. Let's say Obliterate, giving us 20% extra damage, and obviously the Killing Machine causing our Obliteration crits to deal frost damage, which is going to scale obviously off of Mastery. And it's going to be pretty nice also for the Glacial Advance build, considering that you're going to go ahead and get a little bit of extra frost damage on that, which I'm really excited to see in the future. So with this spec, talking about an AoE rotation, one of the things I found out to be very odd with Remorseless Winter when I didn't use it at the beginning of the fight is that it's almost not a damage increase. It's really kind of odd to say. Maybe when we get a few more talents that increase the overall damage of Remorseless Winter, you may hit it a little bit more in, let's say, AoE situations in Shadowlands. But right now on these DPS dummies, whether I hit Remorseless Winter or not does not change my DPS at all, which is a really odd factor. I really do kind of find that a little bit weird here on the DPS dummy, that Remorseless Winter, outside of my initial fight, will not increase my overall pressure, which is really weird. Now, obviously what we're going to do is run it on this target. We're going to hit Empower, we're going to throw a Pillar of Frost, and we're going to burst on this guy pretty hard. The first thing we need to do when we're running at the target is obviously Pillar and Empower are no longer on the global cooldown, so we can hit that and Remorseless Winter all at the same time. And the first thing we're going to do is hit Howling Blast on him to guarantee a Frost Scythe crit, and then the next that we're going to hit is the Frost Scythe crit, which is hopefully going to open up whether we're going to hit Frost Scythe twice or we're going to go back to our Howling Blast proc. But mainly during your burst, your main goal is to generate guaranteed Frost Scythe crits. Now that being said, you do not want to force your crits during this burst. Now you're probably wondering, what does that mean? That means like using a Howling Blast, a non-proc Howling Blast to generate a crit, or using a Frost Scythe to generate a crit, being that we're using Glacial Advance now, because you can generate a crit using Glacial Advance. So it's more beneficial with this spec if you don't get a proc on Howling Blast or you don't have Glacial Advance up to just spam Frost Scythe instead for overall DPS, which is really weird sounding, but it's just kind of the way it seems to be working. I don't know why, but it does, I'd say, close to 500 to 600 more DPS than adding in, let's say, Remorseless Winter or trying to force those overall procs instead of just relying on the overall damage of Frost Scythe, which is why that crit also becomes so important. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys exactly what I'm talking about here. Now, obviously, I'm going to throw up all three of those abilities, hit it with a Howling Blast, and go in with that Frost Scythe. I'm going to either hit it with 2 Frost Scythes, or I'm going to go ahead and rely on the procs that are going to proc up and generate damage. Now, outside of burst, your rotation is generally just going to be spam Frost Scythes until you have a Glacial Advance, throw that up. If you get Howling Blast procs, just throw them up whenever. It doesn't really matter outside of burst. It does matter within burst because it's going to guarantee a crit, and it's what you're really striving for. So if you could have a Glacial Advanced and a Howling Blast on deck, and then you throw a Glacial Advance, guaranteed crit, throw a Howling Blast, guaranteed crit, Frost Scythe twice, throw in another Glacial Advance, you know, it just kind of adds to that synergy of guaranteed crits, and having the guaranteed crits kind of in your back pocket instead of just throwing up, let's say, Glacial Advance and Howling Blast, using both of them, wasting one of the procs, and then throwing up a Frost Scythe. So let's go ahead and start and open up on this target. So we're going to go ahead and throw up those cooldowns, the nice little cooldown abilities there. We're going to go ahead and hit it with a Howling Blast and then open up with a Frost Scythe. Now, determining whether we get a Howling Blast proc, we're going to throw up Howling Blast, or if we don't have enough Runic Power for Glacial Advance, we're just going to go ahead and throw another Frost Scythe and then throw up our Glacial Advance after that. So let's do this. Bam. Bam. We can throw Glacial Advance, so I'm just going to do that. Howling Blast proc, we're going to throw that after, guaranteed crit. We do not have anything. We have Glacial Advance. We're throwing that up. We're just going to go ahead and rely on Frost Scythe. Now, worst comes to worst, if you Frost Scythe twice, even though you have a proc, it's not a big deal. It's not going to make you lose that much overall damage. But outside of burst, obviously, it's not going to matter nearly as much. So you're just going to sit here and spam Frost Scythe all day, throw up them Glacial Advances, because surprisingly, Glacial Advance deals quite a bit of extra burst pressure. Now, when it comes to Remorseless Winter, like I said before, it can either be a DPS loss, or it could be a little bit of a DPS increase. It seems like a wild card, and it doesn't really seem to be very consistent, which I do kind of find to be fairly odd. Now, when you are bursting, let's say with Pillar, you do want to make sure you either have a proc or you have a Glacial Advance to just kind of give you that oomph during burst, which is increasing your overall damage, which is fairly nice. And then you just kind of rely heavily again on using that Frost Scythe ability. Now, this is where it kind of, like I talked about, that haste crit build kind of falling off in comparison to the mastery build, is because right now we've got 5 stacks of Razor Ice. We're not using Remorseless Winter, and we're dealing quite a bit more consistent frost damage than if, let's say, we were relying heavily on the other spec. And that's kind of how you do your little AoE cleave on this guy, damaging your way through a Mythic Plus scenario, dealing quite a bit of pressure. Now, if we look at our damage, it's going to be Frost Scythe on top, obviously, because we're spamming the crap out of that. Next up, we got Glacial Advance, and right on its heels, we've got a Frost Fever, which is our dots. So outside of that, the only other thing that's really going to deal quite a bit of damage is if you're able to benefit a bit more from Howling Blast Burst. But as you can see, Remorseless Winter, even after a couple of uses, it's just not there. The damage just isn't there right now. And I'm hoping that might change when it comes to conduits, so we can maybe benefit a little bit more from that being there. But you notice my DPS is now went up to 3.0 instead of being at 2.8, which I kind of talked about haste crit tapering off, and the mastery spec not tapering off nearly as much. So I'm excited to see what's going on with that in the future. Now we'll go ahead and talk about single target DPS a bit. Now going over single target damage a little bit, as for the level 15 talent, I'm going to be running Cold Heart just to increase my single target by quite a bit more. And as for the level 45 talents, now Gathering Storms would be a bit more beneficial towards single target with your current iteration of Frost, being that casting Glacial Advance is going to be a damage nerf in your overall single target consistent pressure, being that it doesn't deal nearly as much damage as a Frost Strike does when it comes to single target. Now in terms of applying the Razor Ice, it's not nearly as important, being that your main damage source for single target is going to be Obliterate, and trying to maximize those Obliterate crit procs regardless of the way you're doing it, which is most likely going to be either using Howling Blast procs or Frost Strikes, since Frost Strikes do hit quite a bit harder in single target than Glacial Advances do, like I was just saying. So it really just kind of becomes a little bit useless as of right now using Glacial Advance with single target, but hopefully in the future in Shadowlands it's going to be a little bit more useful, getting that extra frost damage, being that Obliterate is also going to deal frost damage, and hopefully scale off it a little bit to give us a reason to insert that into our rotation so it's a little bit more in depth instead of spamming 2 to 3 buttons overall. It would be nice to have at least a little bit extra one there to actually have some fun with during the fight. But as for opening up on the target single target, it's going to be the same as, let's say, the AoE build in terms of throwing up Pillar, Empower, Remorseless, and then going in with a Howling Blast to generate yourself an Obliterate. And from there, if you get a Howling Blast proc, use that, because it's just like, free runes basically at that point. Free runes for, no cost of runes dealing damage. Who can complain about that? And it also hits fairly hard, like 2600 damage, which is fairly good. But overall, Frost Strike crits are going to be your hardest hitting ability right now for single target. But obviously it's going to be a bit different when we start getting conduits and things along those lines. We're going to end up, obviously relying a lot more heavily on, our Obliterates overall, because they are going to hit really, really hard in Shadowlands. So let's go ahead and show you guys the kind of like this damage. Now, other thing we need to cover is obviously Frostworm's Fury. And if you're using Cold Heart or if you're using an Nocturnal Assault, you can just kind of set it and forget it and just go on with your rotation. You don't have to worry about anything. But Cold Heart, you're going to want to insert within the end tail of your Pillar Burst, being that it's going to be your strength stacking, which is consuming runes. And obviously playing an Obliteration build, being that we're relying heavily on Obliterate and spending our runes, it's going to give us quite a bit more strength at the end of our burst than it will at the beginning of our burst, which is also going to cause us to deal quite a bit more burst pressure overall. So opening up single target on the guy, we're going to go ahead and throw up Pillar, throw up our Empower, throw up our Remorseless Winter. We're going to Howling Blast as we're moving towards the target, because obviously nobody starts out a boss fight being directly under its butt unless it has some kind of 30-second monologue and you're just staring at the dude for 30 minutes like Freehold. We're not going to talk about that. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and open up on this target. We're going to throw up those 3 abilities, and we're going to hit our Howling Blast to give us a direct proc. We're going right in on that Obliterate. Now, we did get a Howling Blast proc, so we're going to rely on that. Next up, we're relying on our Frost Strike, since we didn't get a Howling Blast proc. And of course, we got 4 seconds less. Throw in Chains, throwing up Big Dragon, and that's going to be overall how you burst. Now, you just go ahead and continue off that burst. Once you get outside the burst, it's literally just rely on Obliterate damage. Do not get yourself over Runic Power capped, throwing some Frost Strikes here and there, and then go back to relying heavy on your Obliterate damage. Now, Frost Strike, as you can see, does deal quite a bit of damage, so you do want to kind of weave it in there through that consistent pressure instead of relying really heavy during your downtime with Obliterate, because Frost Strike damage with the Mastery build does deal quite a bit more damage. Now, as for when you're going to burst with Pillar, obviously you will want a Frost Strike or a little bit of Runic Power, obviously, to burst with Pillar to deal a little bit more burst pressure coming into it. Now obviously we've got 1 second left. We're going to go ahead and throw in our Chains of Burst and deal quite a bit of more burst pressure. I mean, it's pretty easy, the overall single target build, since there is a bit more control. But yeah, just rely heavily on your Frost Strikes in your downtime, and then during your burst, try to generate Obliterate procs, either using Howling Blast procs or your Frost Strikes. And as I said before, for single target currently, Glacial Advance doesn't seem to be doing very good, but hopefully when Obliterate starts scaling heavy off of Mastery and dealing a bit of frost damage, it will be a bit better overall. So yeah, the other thing we can obviously insert into our little pre thing when we're dealing DPS to something is obviously throwing up our ghoul. I haven't really touched on the ghoul too much. I tend to just kind of forget that he exists because he's a ghoul. He's a goofy dude. He chills over there, doesn't really do much, but he can do a bit of single target DPS, obviously, which will increase your overall boss DPS. So I would say throw him up directly before popping your other things and then run into combat so you don't have to waste a global cooldown on him, because that will hurt your damage a little bit going ahead and throwing him up in combat instead of just tossing him up before. Since he does last a minute, he will be around a very long time in the fight. So I hope you guys enjoyed this Mythic plus DPS video. It's going to be kind of like what my strategy is going into Shadowlands leveling, doing dungeons and having fun. So again, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and of course, until next time, this was your boy Hazzed.